I've heard that there are these mythical creatures who never make any mistakes when they sew. And get this, they actually finish their projects within the time frame they think they need to get it done. Well, just to keep things interesting for my husband, I'm not one of those mythical creatures. And if you're not either, join me as we count how many mistakes I can make while making Mrs. Depew's drafted home 1950 slip. And because I know people will ask, you will find the link to this pattern in the description box below. Hopefully, sharing the mistakes I made will prevent you from making the same ones I did, so it won't take you a long time like it took me to finish what I thought would be a 2-day project. I think my new tagline should be, I make the sewing mistakes so that you don't have to. And I don't even have to drink in order to make them. Cranberry sauce, not cranberry sauce, cranberry juice. Anyway, stick around until the end where I show off the finished slip and share with you why I think I made so many mistakes. Because the problems were definitely self-inflicted. By the way, this is the mock-up behind me. And if you're interested in getting my 28-page sewing guide in a PDF format with full instructions on how to make this slip, including information about learning from my mistakes while making it, I'll share that info at the end too, since the vintage patterns that this Mrs. Depew drafted home 1950 slip is based on doesn't come with instructions. Previously, on Modern Retro Woman, I pinned everything back up and saw that it was good. And there you have it. Sorry. And this is where I made my biggest mistake that impacted this whole project. And it had nothing to do with the pattern itself. As you watch the video, see if you can figure out what it was. After enlarging the pattern and trying it out on my dress form, as I showed you in the previous video, it was time to make the mock-up slip to test the fit and work out any issues. This step is imperative because you want to get everything right before cutting into your good fabric. And all of the mistakes I made while making this project are a prime example of why doing a practice run is so important. Remember, no matter which pattern you're using, always do a practice run on your first attempt at making it. Mistake number 1. Hey, you forgot to true the pattern. Yep, friends, I forgot to check the pattern pieces against each other to see if they were the same length and if the corners matched. Now, put a pin in that because you'll see why it was a problem later on. For my mock-up, or toile, as they call it in couture, or muslin in the fashion industry, I used Bimberg rayon lining instead of muslin fabric because it has the same fabric content and a similar drape to the rayon batiste I am using for the final version of my slip. To take advantage of the natural stretch of the bias, I folded my fabric so that it created a 90-degree angle. I then pinned my front piece along the bias fold. Yes, I'm still an old school pin girl. Definitely not a pin-up, pin girl. I then marked a 1/2 inch cutting line along the edges and cut it out. Mistake number 2. Wait, shouldn't you use at least a 1-inch seam allowance on a mock-up to give you just-in-case room for alterations? Why, yes. Yes, you should. I then repeated the process for the center back, marking a 1/2 inch seam allowance along the sides and bottom. Mistake number 3. Didn't you also make a seam allowance along the top edge of the back bodice? Nope. Totally spaced out and cut it out without a seam allowance. I then folded the fabric to get the straight grain for the side back piece. While I was marking the top of the side back, I realized I forgot to do a seam allowance for the top of the center back piece, so I had to draw a decreasing seam allowance. And then I sewed the pieces together using a French seam. Mistakes number 4 and 5. Weren't you supposed to stay stitch the neckline and the bias cut pieces to keep them from growing? And OMG, you sewed French seams instead of basting them? What were you thinking? So, yeah, this is where I started realizing that I had a really big problem and had really screwed up. A couple of the pieces were a lot longer than their partner piece, but because I had forgotten to true the pattern pieces and I had forgotten to stay stitch the bias cut pieces, I didn't know if the mismatch was because the pattern piece was that much longer, or if the piece had grown because of handling fabric cut on the bias. Well, it turns out it was a bit of both. As for using French seams instead of basting the seam, the front of the slip fit on the dress form beautifully, but the back had about an inch of excess fabric. Again, I didn't know if this was because of the pattern or if the center back had grown from being handled. And somewhere in here, my beloved vintage Bernina sewing machine, the one I learned to sew on, the one that belonged to my grandmother, just said, nope, I can't do this anymore. And a problem that 2 different old school mechanics, one in the Midwest and one out here in California, had repaired, reared its head again. I spent the next 1.5 days carefully unstitching, which is the nice way of saying ripping out, the back seams and the side seams, and mourning the maybe permanent loss of my workhorse mechanical Bernina. Although, to be honest, I have to say, once I switched over to using my 25-year-old Viking, the sewing parts of the project became much easier and faster. After unstitching everything, I basted the seams like I should have in the first place and marked the changes that needed to be made and transferred them to my pattern. I then affixed the pattern to brown paper using tape and marked a 5/8 inch seam allowance on the brown paper. I decided to use 5/8 of an inch instead of my usual 1/2 inch because I realized how rusty I am with doing French seams when I was sewing them up on the mock-up. I cut the pieces out, made some notches, and then stapled the pieces to the brown paper using a long arm stapler. Mistake number 6. Hey, aren't you going to be adding a ruffle? Shouldn't you have shortened the pattern to the appropriate length before making your final pattern? So, yeah, I ended up wasting fabric and making the hemming process a little harder than it needed to be because I forgot to do this step. Thank goodness I had ordered a little extra, so I had enough fabric despite this goof. Cutting out the slip in the good fabric was basically the same process as when I made the mock-up, except that I didn't need to add any seam allowances because they had been added to the craft paper. I used rayon batiste for my slip that I bought from Mood Fabric on sale. Many mid-century slips were made from rayon because of its silk-like drape and sheen, which could mimic a silk slip. Also, it's lightweight and it's breathable, which makes it perfect for hot California summers. As an aside, Professor Google tells me that the American pronunciation is Batiste, Batiste, Batiste. I've only heard it pronounced Batiste, which is the British pronunciation according to Professor Google. Go figure. Anyway, even though it's not slippery like charmeuse or satin, it is wigglier than a bunch of preschoolers before a holiday party. And like those wiggly children, it requires patience to encourage it to do what you want it to do. Mistake number 7. You made a video about how to make a slip and used white fabric and white lace on a white dress form in a room with white walls. Yeah, that doesn't really have anything to do with making the garment, but it does make it a little harder for you to see what I'm talking about. So I'm sorry about that. After I cut out the pattern pieces, I stay stitched all the edges, not only because it prevents stretching on the bias, but I saw several recommendations to do a stay stitch to help cut down on the wiggliness of the fabric. Is that a word? If not, it should be. Also, several textile experts recommend using French seams with batiste, which is good because it's one of my favorite ways to finish seams. I sewed the side front and center front princess seams that turn into bust darts. The end of the dart didn't disappear for me and lay flat the way we usually want a dart to do, but I'm okay with that because it made just a slight pucker and many mid-century slips have gathered cups. To sew a French seam, sew a 1/4 inch seam with wrong sides facing each other. Trim the seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. Press the seam to set it, and then press it to one side. Turn the joined pieces over and press again to make sure it's flat, and then fold along the seam with the right sides together. The raw edges of the unfinished seams should be inside. I'd like to press again just to give it a heads up about my expectations for it. And to be on the safe side, I used lots of pins to reinforce for the fabric that I expected to make a nice pretty seam for me. I then sewed it up with a 1/2 inch seam allowance with the raw edges encased. And I can hear some of you veterans, French seam people going, "Oh, that sounds so huge." Well, here's the deal. I'm kind of rusty right now with my French seams since my biggest sewing projects for the 10 years before I retired were basically masks for the Mister and me and making quick and easy chef style aprons to give as gifts. When I feel confident with my French seams again, I'll make 1/2 inch seam allowances when I cut the pattern and sew with nice and pretty 1/4 inch seam allowances for both steps. And if you watched my apron UFO video, you know that I can be pretty hard on myself for not being perfect. And I think that's a result of, having a PhD. But I'm really trying to give myself grace as I'm relearning my sewing skills. And I think it's that grace that is allowing me to embrace all of my mistakes I've made on this project and share them with you. Besides, there are only two people who are going to see those big old seams, the Mister and myself. And I can tell you that the Mister won't care, and this slip is a perfect project to practice making French seams. So, enough of the soapbox. Back to sewing. I stitched the remaining seams with French seams. I then measured and basted the ribbon to the top of the points in front of the slip and to the center side back panels. That seam. My center back was still about an inch too big, despite my futzing and checking the pattern pieces before cutting it out. Later, I'll show you my workaround to solve that problem. I originally thought I would be using elasticized lace that I also bought from Mood Fabrics for the trim. I ended up abandoning that idea in favor of a bias facing, using a technique for a V-neck facing I found in the Singer sewing book from 1949. I measured the neckline and then cut fabric on the bias to make the tape, 1.5 inches wide. All of the practice I got making the tape for the vintage-inspired aprons really paid off. Since I had more confidence in what I was doing, I was able to cut the fabric into strips without being overwhelmed by the wiggliness of the fabric. And it was wiggly. It wanted to be wiggly. So before I pinned the bias facing to the neckline, I sewed a row of stitching along the top of the center back piece with my machine's basting stitch. I then pulled on the thread all along it until the back was about an inch narrower than before. Because it was spread across the entire width, it wasn't perceptible, and it got rid of the gap. I basically eased the top of the bodice back. I then pinned and then hand basted the facing to the neckline, starting in the back and stitched it to the slip, mitering the corners at the top of the points on the front, and making sure that the ribbon was sandwiched between the slip and the facing. I stopped short of the center front by about an inch on either side of the V. Mistake number 8. Why didn't you fold the edges of the bias tape before you sewed it to the slip? Well, here, my mistake was not trusting my instincts. The instructions said to fold 1/4 of the raw edge of the facing under after sewing it to the neckline. So instead of folding along one edge before I sewed it, I decided to wait. Unfortunately, it wasn't as easy to do as the book made it seem, and it added an unbelievable amount of time to the process that could have been avoided if I had folded the edge ahead of time. So at the V, I basted a mitered seam in the bias tape and trimmed off the excess. I then pressed that little seam open and trimmed the ends of the seam. I basted the rest of the bias facing to the slip neckline. I stitched the rest of the facing to the neckline, trimmed and clipped the seam allowance. I stitched the rest of the facing to the neckline, trimmed and clipped the seam allowance. I then pressed the facing to the inside and stitched the facing down along the folded edge, knowing that the stitching would be hidden by the application of the lace. For the lace, I decided to crisscross the lace in the front, similar to the pattern illustration. Starting at one dart, I pinned the lace up and around the neckline and then finished at the other dart. I then stitched it in place. Mistake number 9. You didn't hand baste the lace to the slip before stitching it? Nope. I'll admit that I just wanted to be done with the slip by this time and decided to skip basting it. Big mistake. Big mistake. The pins caused the lace to warp just a little bit, and it became clear that when I took the pins out while sewing, that the pinning had caused the amount of lace needed to be different than what I had pinned down. I had to keep stopping and repinning. You'd think that I would do the logical thing and just baste the rest of it. But no, clearly, logic was not entering the chat. When I finished with the lace, the basic part of the slip was finished. It was time to put it on the dress form to let it hang. I remember when I was in 7th or 8th grade, and my grandmother was helping me make a gunny sack style skirt with a big old ruffle all on it out of some flowery polyester crepe fabric something, and I wanted to wear it to school the next day. I was so annoyed when she said we had to let it hang for a couple days, or else the hem would become uneven as the bias and crepe of the fabric relaxed. She was right, of course, but that's one of those things you have to learn. Garments cut on the bias are very forgiving fit-wise, but they aren't make it in the morning and wear it that night kind of project. After letting the slip hang for 48 hours, it was time to even out the hem. As I mentioned previously, I didn't make the pattern shorter before cutting out the fabric, so I ended up wasting fabric. I have a gizmo that was my grandmother's that looks like a yardstick stuck on a block and has a clamp at the top for easy pinning. Unfortunately, because we are temporarily living in my husband's childhood home, clearing it out and preparing it for sale, my sewing stuff is currently in storage. So I had to go old school and just measure up from the floor using a yardstick and putting pins in the slip. I then lightly pressed along the pin line, removing the pins and using a styling design ruler that I got at a National Craft store to mark the cutting line. Then it was time to make the ruffle. I decided to make my ruffle only 1.5 times the width of the bottom of the slip, even though Mrs. Depew recommends 2 times the width. But the ruffle on my slip is more for show rather than to add fullness under a garment. Because I'm only 5'3", my ruffle is 6 inches deep, and I added about 1 inch for seam allowance and a narrow hem. Clipping through the selvage, I went old school and, like those ladies used to do at the fabric stores, tore the strips of fabric I needed for the ruffle. I then sewed the ruffle pieces together using French seams. Then I hemmed the ruffle and applied lace along the bottom edge of the ruffle. It was a lot of lace, even though the ruffle was only 1.5 times the width of the slip. I think it was 9 yards, something. It was crazy. Mistake number 10. Please tell me that you basted it before sewing it in place. You'd think I would have learned my lesson by now, right? But of course, I was being quite stubborn in my disregard for respecting the sewing process. I don't have a ruffle attachment, so I made 2 rows of basting stitches all the way around the top of the ruffle. I then quartered the bottom of my slip and the top of the ruffle and pinned the ruffle to the slip at the quarter marks. I then subdivided each section into equal parts and pinned those. I pulled up the basting stitches into even gathers and pinned them copiously. And then you know what I did? I actually basted the ruffle to the slip. I know, crazy. It took several episodes of Perry Mason, the Raymond Burr version, of course, but I did it. I then pressed the gathers flat to make the seam easier to sew and stitched the ruffle and the slip together using a regular seam. After pressing and trimming the seam, I finished it with an overcast stitch since I don't have a serger. On the outside, I edge stitched the ruffle seam allowance to the skirt. One final pressing, and I was done. Finally. My 2-day project took a lot longer than I thought it would because of all of my self-inflicted mistakes. But I'm glad I stuck with it, aside from the promise to you all that I would share the project with you. It's a good pattern that I highly recommend, and I learned a lot in the process of making it. Because I know people will ask, I want to remind you that you can find the link to the pattern in the description box below the video. So, have you figured out the overarching reason why I made so many mistakes? If you said it was because I didn't respect the process, you would be correct. Basically, I was overconfident in my abilities and decided that I didn't need to do all of the steps, such as basting or measuring twice. I believed that by skipping the steps, I'd save myself time so that I could get the project done in a couple of days. But my shortcuts ended up being long detours and made the project much more time-consuming and tedious than it needed to be. So, based on my experience with this project, my advice to you is to respect the process. There are reasons our mentors told us to do things a certain way or in a certain order. That doesn't mean that it's the only way, but we still need to trust the process in the same way that we respect the characteristics of a fabric when we are working with it. As you know, this pattern doesn't come with instructions, so I've written a 28-page sewing guide that has lots of pictures and detailed instructions derived from my journey creating this vintage drafted home slip, and it's exclusively for my Patreon members at the Elegance Circle level. If you'd like to support my work and receive a copy of the sewing guide, search for the link to the Modern Retro Woman Patreon community in the description box below this video, down below, and join at the Elegance Circle level. It's a monthly membership, currently $10 a month at the date of this video, and you may cancel at any time with no hard feelings. Really, I understand. My next project will be to learn how to make a sewing pattern block using the Haslam pattern cutting system. This is a true vintage pattern drafting system based on a whole bunch of measurements. I will be using the system I used for this 1950s slip project, which as some pointed out in the comments to my previous video, it should actually be called an enlarging system rather than a drafting system. And the Haslam system to create a new post-pandemic and now retirement-friendly wardrobe so that I can get shaken out of the jeans and knit top doldrums and feel fabulous. Anywho, if you are like me and are in the process of rebuilding your wardrobe for this season of your life, or you're ready to take your personal presentation to the next level by incorporating timeless charm school advice into your everyday life, I invite you to click on the subscribe and notification buttons to make sure you know when new videos arrive. And be sure to check out other Modern Retro Woman resources in the description, including a link to a freebie for joining my mailing list. I usually send out a newsletter each week that shares wisdom from our mid-century mentors on how to live a gracious and elegant life. Also, let YouTube's algorithm know that it should share this video with kindred spirits by clicking the like button and sharing it with your friends. And I never quite know what to do here, but you know the drill. Check out these videos on fearlessly drafting your own patterns and how to make your own dress form if you haven't watched them yet. Until next time, thank you to my Patreon community for your support and have a fabulous Technicolor day. Bye now.